Today, I'd like to tell you about some of the work that we have done and been working on related to a product that's come out called Geckskin. And this is a long evolving story and it involves many people. And so just in case I forget to introduce them throughout the talk, I'd like to introduce some of the main players. So Duncan Urshik is a professor here at UMass Amherst in biology. He and I have collaborated for some time, and you'll hear through this talk today about when we started to meet each other and how that collaboration came about. Mike Bartlett, Andrew Kroll, Dan King, Mike Imbergia, and Satyan Chowdhury are all PhD students that worked on this project over the years with me. Mike, Andrew, and Dan are all professors at different universities around the world. Mike Imbergia and Satyan both work at companies. And Beth Parrott was an undergraduate art history major who worked in my lab for about 3 years at the beginning of this project and had some really nice essential roles in both the development of the technology and visualization of some of our findings. So with that, I'd like to jump in and talk about geckos. I think we're all aware, I'm sure if you've traveled anywhere tropical or maybe not even so tropical, you may have seen a lizard, may have been a gecko. And some of the amazing things that they can adhere to a wide variety of surfaces, like this really complex tree trunk that was imaged by Duncan and his collaborators. Or they can even stick inside your house on the wall or up on the ceiling or on the window. And they can do really amazing things because it's not just about sticking there, but it's also about removing that adhesion or that adhesive device and running to get away from prey or predators. And this amazing ability to not only stick really strongly, but also release and run and move and locomote is some of the reasons why geckos have provided a lot of inspiration for thousands of years to scientists and engineers. So a lot of the secrets to how this works, not surprisingly, work or start to point to their adhesive pads, which are located on their toe pads that are shown here, whether they're attaching to glass or trying to peel away in this really cool way of how they bend back their toe pads as they run and prepare to run. If we zoom in, so a lot of researchers back in the, well, actually for the last several decades, started to wonder what allows a gecko to have this amazing performance, right, of stick and release, and to do it on such a huge variety of surfaces. So the first thing that scientists started to do was really zoom in on these toe pad surfaces, and we can do that. So the first thing you notice are these rays, or arrays of what are called lamellae. Okay, that make up each of the toe pads on this gecko here that we're looking at. If you zoom in with an electron microscope onto one of these lines or one of these lamellae, what you're going to see are these arrays of hairs, hair-like structures, and these are called setae. Okay, and they're made out of keratin, beta keratin, just like your hair or your fingernails, made out of the same exact material. And they're down at the base of the setae, they have about the same diameter as one of our hairs, maybe just a little smaller. But as you branch up and come to the tip, they actually split again. Many of them will split again into what are called spatulae. And they're made out of the same material again, but they get even smaller. Okay, so now you can see that the width of one of these spatulae is around 200 nanometers or so. This is incredibly small. And the thickness is about 5 nanometers. So you're getting down to the dimensions of one protein thick. Obviously, as scientists started to discover this amazingly hierarchical structure, they started to say, this must be the secret to what is allowing a gecko to perform some of its amazing functions of adhesion. And so back in the early 2000s, a lot of scientists and a lot of engineers started to say, okay, if we can mimic these hair-like features, then we will be able to have similar performance. And so there was a huge effort involving many scientists and engineers. We were part of that effort. Like I said, maybe there were about 30 to 40 research groups around the world really looking at this. I'm just featuring a couple examples here that were really cool. This is out of Professor Li Ming Dai's, where they took carbon nanotubes, covered it on a little piece of silicon wafer about the size of a fingernail, and they were able to hang up a textbook. Or this is Sticky Bot out of Mark Kukoski's lab in Stanford, and they were able to make small little pads on not quite carbon nanotubes, but similar small features, and have a robot that can climb up a wall. this was cool technology, but if they tried to make something larger, okay, so if I just made this a larger textbook or a little larger robot, it would all fall, okay? So there was a lot of problems of trying to figure out how do we actually scale this or actually use this technology on larger things, okay? And that's one of the ways that we got into the research that I'm going to tell you about today. Part of the reason why engineers were so fascinated by this of making smaller and smaller features on the surface or these hairs, not just did they see them on the bottom of a gecko foot, but they looked at plots that looked like this. So this is actually counting on the y-axis here, counting how many hairs or these setae per area are found on different organisms. The lizards here are the geckos, but you can see that these hair-like features are found on spiders and bugs and flies and beetles. And they can count the number of hairs and compare them to the size of the organism, so the mass or how much they weigh. And what you find is the heavier animals or the heavier organisms had more hairs per area. That means that I'm making smaller and smaller features. And so this map here became a guiding pathway that a lot of engineers said, okay, if I want to hold up maybe a person, then I need to be way out here and need to make really, really small fibers. Now, the problem with this, though, is that if you don't include enough data, you may come to the wrong conclusion. So there were some other scientists, this is out of Robert Full's lab at Berkeley and Tony Russell's lab up at the University of Calgary. They made the exact same plot, but instead of just highlighting 6 or so data points here for the geckos, they looked at a much larger data set. This whole group up here are the geckos, and the body mass varied by 10,000 times. And what you see, if I look across all of these series of geckos, is that actually the number of hairs doesn't really change. So the size of these hair-like features or setae doesn't really change. So when we started, as a group, started comparing these two plots, we started to say, what is the scaling parameter? What allows an animal or nature to use adhesion at all different size scales? Because it's not the hairs. That's what this data is telling us. And another way of saying this is, how can we understand how to use adhesion for something as small as a leaf beetle to something as large as a gorilla, okay? Nature has taken care of using it for lizards down to leaf beetles, but we wanted to make the leap of something as large as a gorilla or maybe a person being able to use adhesion for locomotion. So the way that we approach this, having been inspired by all these different sources and different observations in nature, was to take a step back. We actually started by developing a theory, a scaling theory. So we actually started with the math. We wanted to almost ignore a lot of the specific features that were found in different organisms and start to think about what controls this from a mathematical point of view. And this is where Andrew Kroll and Mike Bartlett, a postdoc and a PhD student at the time in my group, came about. And we developed a theory. And there were some critical assumptions in here. I'm not going to go through them today, but at the end, it came out to be a very simple theory that the force capacity of this adhesive pad is going to be dictated by 3 terms of van der Waals forces between the pad and whatever surface it's trying to come into contact with. We can discuss van der Waals during questions, but they basically exist between any 2 surfaces. So they're not very special, okay? And you can't do anything to scale them. The other parameters are the area, how large your toe pad is. That makes sense. If I want to hang something heavy or have a lot of force capacity, then I need to have a larger pad. However, it is divided by compliance, and compliance is how soft something is. Okay, so if I want to have a large force capacity, then I want to make this softness or the compliance really small. And for most materials, this is a problem. Because if I want to have a large area of contact, I usually make something really soft and squishy to make sure that it gets into all the nooks and crannies. So if I make something soft and try to get something large, then this ratio here doesn't continue to increase. So how does nature do this? How does it make a large area, but also make something not soft? So this is what we needed to figure out. This is what the math looks like behind. I know we have some teachers and we have some students. There really is math behind here. The theory isn't just all words. There's a lot of good calculus and differential equations that come out, but the final equation looks like this. This is what that equation looks like in symbol form. So this GC here is the strength of the van der Waals forces, this A is the area, and this C is the compliance. So this was a theory, it's a hypothesis at the time. We had to go through, we ran hundreds, I think maybe even up to 1,000 different experiments on different synthetic materials just to prove that this works. The fact that this line, this black line, goes through all these different data points told us that it worked. So we felt pretty confident in this, but then we started to think, how can we take advantage of this? How do we actually make a material that can be really non-soft or stiff, so have a small value of C, but still have a large area of contact? And the idea came to us, or the inspiration came to us one Sunday afternoon, that this is exactly what fabrics do. Okay, so fabrics and textiles are designed, they're materials that have been around for about 80,000 to 100,000 years, and they're designed to conform to really complex surfaces and objects, but yet when I pull on a fabric along the fiber, it's really stiff. So you can have a large ratio of A and a small value of C. This gives us a really large force capacity. So we wanted to test this. So on Monday morning, literally on Monday morning, I asked Andrew and Mike at the time to run down to the local Jo-Ann Fabrics. They bought some nylon fabric. They coated it with a very soft piece of elastomer, or soft elastomer called polydimethylsiloxane, which is a common material found in like bathroom caulking and silly putty and things like this. And they made an adhesive device. I know you can't hear them talking, but they're explaining what this pad looked like, or this pad was made up of. You can see it's about the size of your hand. So it's about a 4-inch by 4-inch square pad. And they're gonna hold up a 45-pound weight, or try to hold one up, okay? They're gonna hold this up onto a piece of plexiglass that they had set up between 2 file cabinets that were in a hallway outside our labs. So they hold it up, and then they're gonna tilt it just a little bit, and it's gonna be a really fast release. You can't hear the bang, but you'll watch it fall. So it comes off really quickly. And we were super thrilled when we found this result, because this was exactly how we developed that whole theory. And like I said, I didn't go into all the details, but we wanted to snap off. It would either be on or off. So it's about this really unstable failure. And that's exactly at the heart of the theory. And so everything they developed here said it's working. But the fabrics that you buy at Jo-Ann Fabrics are not the stiffest fabrics that you can find in the world. Okay, we knew this as material scientists. So we went on and to make new composites, or new adhesive composites, but now rather than using a nylon fabric like the black one that was in that video, we substituted and started to make these adhesive pads out of carbon fiber based fabrics. This is a plain weave carbon fiber fabric. And if you cut this through the, or like cut this along this line, you can look at it from the end and you'll see the bundles of carbon fibers here. And it's bound, in this case, this is not polydimethylsiloxane, but it's a polyurethane. And importantly, what I want to point out is that the top, this is the top surface of these pads, they're completely smooth. They have no hair-like features, no setae, because again, our theory told us that actually by making those hair-like features, you will be compromising the strength of this surface. And so we wanted to make these completely smooth. We replaced the function of the setae that the gecko uses by using a very soft elastomer, this polyurethane. And that replaced everything without having to make it very hair-like. This is the work of Mike Bartlett and the other PhD student, Dan King. And by making this composite, we were now able to move on from not just one plate of 45 pounds, but you'll see here that we have 5 plates. They're taking one of these pads and they're going to attach it to glass. And you can see that we became a little bit more sophisticated with our setup here. We didn't have file cabinets or anything. And we now have some safety gear on their shoes in case these plates fall. They're going to lower these weights down. So right now this weight is holding up those, or this chain is holding up those weights. Mike is releasing that. And all of these 5 plates are now going to be placed to be held by this one single pad, which is actually the same size as that previous one. It looks a little different in proportion, but it's the exact same area. What you find, now there's no tension on the chain. All the tension is on that pad. And at the time, they wanted it, when you're holding up 250 pounds on a piece of glass, you can get a little nervous. So they wanted to practice to make sure that you're confident in this result. So they did this little jig. And I'm going to scoot ahead here a little bit. And you'll see that Mike will just go ahead and put the weight back on the chain so we don't let it slam down into the floor like we did in our very first measurement. So that'll come off. They'll disconnect the weight and they'll just peel it right off. And you can use this over and over again to do that. In fact, we still have that same pad around in our labs today. So sticking to smooth surfaces is really cool, but obviously geckos can stick to a wide variety of surfaces. We wanted to handle this as well. And we developed and extended our theory. I won't take the time to explain how it all happens, but essentially you can find this video up on our YouTube channel. We used the exact same kind of approach. We made a slightly different pad now out of glass fiber-based fabrics, and we can march different weights around all around our building without cleaning any of the surfaces or cleaning any of the pads. So it's going from a painted door onto a painted drywall. In this same video, they go outside, they go onto concrete, they go onto different plaster surfaces, glass surfaces, metal surfaces, all around. So let's come back to the gecko. Like I said, we started by looking at this theory after becoming inspired by all the different animals and how they were working. But we felt like this equation was teaching us something about how the gecko actually does what it does, because it's the largest of the organisms that can use adhesion for locomotion. So we were studying at the time some of the work of Duncan Urshik, who back in 1996 at the University of California, Berkeley, made some of the first measurements on full-body geckos, okay? And he had actually measured that for a tokay gecko, which is about 50 grams in mass, just a little smaller than the forearm of your arm. They can hold up about 20 apples or 20 newtons of force. So he had measured the force capacity. Other people by the name of Keller Autumn had measured the strength of GC for geckos. Duncan had measured area, but nobody had measured the compliance of a gecko. So we couldn't test our theory right away. So this one, we reached out to Duncan. He had actually become a professor about a year prior to us reaching out to him at UMass Amherst. So we were pretty lucky to have him here in Amherst. We reached out and we started to measure the compliance of a gecko. And this is one of the initial measurements here. We let the gecko establish their own contact with a glass plate. And as we pulled the plate away from the gecko, we're measuring the amount of force that the gecko is exerting on that plate. And that allows us to actually measure the compliance of the gecko, as well as the force capacity, that FC. And this is what the data looks like. It looks incredibly linear, and there's some other fascinating science behind this, but it's incredibly linear. Here's FC, here's 1 over the compliance. And we can take this data and actually start to plot it. And we not only tested one gecko, but we wanted to test a range of sizes. Remember, our whole idea here was to understand how nature moves across different size ranges and can use adhesion. And this is what this team of PhD students, this is Casey Gilman, who was a student in Duncan's group, that tested and plotted all the data. And amazingly, if you take all of the different data points and plot it, it actually continues to follow this scaling. And one of the cool things that we discovered was that by understanding the anatomy, which Tony Russell at the University of Calgary had documented many years ago, that geckos are one of the only organisms that have tendons in their lamellae that extend from the skin, basically, these lamellae. The tendon goes directly up into the skeleton. So in their body, in geckos, tendons connect bone to skin. That's completely different than in our body, where tendons connect muscle to bone. So here, the tendon, which is one of the most stiff fibers and tissues found in nature, is providing that very stiff connection. So it's a very small value of C that allows us to have this large force capacity for the gecko. So the tendon and the tendon construction in geckos are really at the heart of the innovation. And it's not the hairs or the setae, but it's this tendon connection behind that plays such a critical role. And so what I think is really cool about some of this story that we've been able to be a part of in our lab and discover is that nature provided the initial inspiration, led us to new theories, which then we tested and experimented with. We actually innovated by creating this new technology. But through this innovation and through this understanding, we actually were able to give back to nature and help connect some of the reasons for why geckos and all of the other organisms that use adhesion for locomotion, how they work, and move beyond just understanding what's on the surface. We've actually been able to take this understanding much, much farther. There's many other parts of this story that I can continue to tell you about. One part is that we were able to change the material systems to be fully compostable and still have the same purpose or the same function. So this is a kind of a cool new development, especially in today's day and age, of being able to make adhesives that not only can be used many times, but when it's done with its lifetime, they can go back and be reused again at a later point. And I'd like to finish with some final thoughts on bioinspiration. So a couple of 100 million years ago, obviously, birds came onto this planet. And since then, humans have always been fascinated with flight, okay? And, you know, the taking flight is one of the most common, maybe, examples of bioinspiration. Birds can fly, humans cannot. How can we make that happen? How can we take advantage of flying? And of course, you know the famous story of Daedalus and Icarus. And what they focused on at the beginning, back many, many thousands of years ago for bioinspiration from birds, was the keratinous features of the feather. The feather, everybody thought, must be the key because humans do not have feathers, birds have feathers, therefore we must make something out of feathers in order to have flight. Obviously, if you know this myth, that didn't go so well. The feathers themselves don't really give rise to the flight. It wasn't until a couple hundreds or 1,000 years later that Da Vinci actually told us it's the shape and the stiffness of the wing structure. The stiffness and the shape, or the underlying structure of the wing, that is really the critical element of giving rise to flight. It's not the keratinous features on the surface. And as you know today, we take advantage of the stiffness and the shape to give rise to the flight and the planes that we use. And so in very much the same way, for the Geckskin story, it's the story, the stiffness and the geometry and the shape of the tendon structures underneath that we use and we mimic to create the same functionality that the gecko uses in its everyday life. And with that, I'd like to also acknowledge all the funding sources. As Phil had mentioned, it's incredibly important today to realize that your tax monies are being used to help us understand and help us innovate and impact the way we use materials and material science in the world around us. And I'd also like to finish just coming back to the students. Without them, none of this would be really happening. And we have a lot of fun working as a team on all of these research topics.
You know, sort of in your work, and I'm sure you've talked to a lot of other scientists and researchers, are there any other sort of like materials that you found that you know of that have been other, like, you know, inspired by nature? So my first go-to was always owl feathers and helicopters, but, you know, that's an entirely different direction than materials.
Well, I mean, Phil already mentioned Velcro. That's definitely one of the most famous ones from a materials point of view. I mean, there's a lot of work going on, a lot of materials coming out that are bio-inspired. They're not all in the market right now, or not many of them, but there's a lot. I mean, we're working on a lot of systems that are actually inspired by some of the fastest moving organisms. So we have some new materials. They're called elastomagnetic metamaterials. I need a better name, but it's not like Geckskin. But they're materials that can give you an extra boost of energy when you're trying to do some really fast movements or move some robots and things like that. But there's a huge array, I mean, of people that take inspiration from plants like the Venus flytrap, or from plants like lotus leaves in terms of repelling water and making some different paints. There's also lots of different ways to control color, like butterfly wings do, like where you don't have to rely upon pigments, but can use structure in a material.
To close us out, share a little bit about where do you see your research going next?
For us, actually, we have some recent collaborations over the last couple of years, also along fetal kind of contacts, not during fetal surgery, but also actually helping during the delivery process. in some ways, but probably to something different. We're also have new collaborations with some companies in the space exploration and space management arena. So there's new things to come out there.
Awesome. I personally very much look forward to it.